I'm 75, and I spent 30 years angry at my father, making peace. With a dead man changed everything. My father has been dead for 22 years, and I am still, in certain moments, in conversation with him. Not the way people mean that metaphorically, not in the vague sense of carrying someone's influence forward, but in the actual sense, the sense in which I find myself saying things to him in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon that I never said when he was alive, and that have, in the saying, changed something in me that 30 years of anger never changed. My name is Raymond. I'm 75 years old, and the most important relationship of my life is one that the other person has not been present for in over 2 decades. And what I want to tell you is how that happened, and what it cost, and what, finally, and at considerable expense, it gave me. I have to start with the anger, because the anger is where the story actually begins, and because I think the anger deserves to be described honestly, rather than in the retrospective softening that forgiveness. Narratives sometimes apply to the feelings that preceded the forgiveness. I was genuinely angry at my father for 30 years. Not a background irritation, not a mild grievance, not the complicated ambivalence that most people carry toward imperfect parents. A real and sustained anger that occupied significant territory in my interior life across 3 decades, and that shaped decisions and relationships, and the person I became in ways that I'm still mapping at 75. He deserved some of it. I want to say that, too, at the beginning, because the version of this story that is most convenient is the one where the anger turns out to have been entirely misplaced, where the understanding of the father reveals him to have been simply misunderstood, and the anger dissolves cleanly into compassion without remainder. That is not my story. My father did things that warranted anger, and the anger was in some respects an accurate response to real events. And the forgiveness I arrived at, eventually, and with great difficulty, was not the erasure of that accuracy, but something I had to build alongside it, which is a harder and more interesting thing to do. I grew up in Detroit in the 1950s and 1960s, the oldest of 3 children, and my father was a complicated man in the specific way that men of his generation and circumstance were complicated. Which is to say, he was a man who had been given very little permission to be anything other than functional, and who had organized his entire identity around his ability to provide and to maintain control of the things within his domain, because those were the measures available to him, and because he had no other framework for understanding his own worth. He worked in the automotive industry, in a supervisory role at a plant on the east side of Detroit, and he brought home to his family the management style that he practiced at work, which was the style of a man who understood authority as the primary tool for producing desired outcomes and who had no experience of any other approach working as well. He was not physically abusive. I want to say that clearly because the picture I am drawing could be mistaken for a more extreme portrait than the one I intend. He did not hit us, but he was domineering in a way that filled the house with a particular quality of atmosphere, a pressure, a sense that what he thought and what he wanted and how he assessed any given situation was the only assessment that carried real weight, and that disagreement with that assessment was not a position you held for long without consequences. My mother navigated this with a skill and a patience that I could admire without fully understanding until I was old, enough to see it clearly, which was long after she was no longer in a position to receive the admiration. She was a woman of genuine warmth and intelligence who had organized her life around the management of my father's considerable requirements, and who had done so with enough grace that the organization was not always visible, though it was always present, and though it cost her things that I understood only in retrospect, and that made me angry on her behalf, in addition to my own. The specific source of my anger, the event that crystallized what had been a general discomfort into something harder and more specific, happened when I was 22 years old. I had graduated from college and had decided to pursue graduate study in literature, which was the thing I was genuinely passionate about, and which my father regarded with a contempt that he made no significant effort to conceal. He did not conceal it in the small ways that a person can conceal contempt while still communicating it. The slight shift in expression, the particular quality of a silence, he did not conceal it at all. He told me, directly and in front of my mother and my younger siblings, that studying literature was what people did when they were afraid to do anything real, that I was wasting his investment in my education on a self-indulgence that would produce nothing, and that if I chose to do it, I would be choosing it without his support, financial or otherwise. I had expected opposition. I had not expected the public nature of it, the willingness to say what he said in front of the people I most needed to not have witnessed my diminishment. And the combination of the content and the delivery produced in me something that I can describe now as the moment the anger became structural, became part of the load-bearing architecture of who I was, rather than a feeling I was having in response to a situation. It moved in, and it stayed. I went to graduate school. My father and I did not speak for 2 years, which was his choice expressed as mine. The familiar dynamic of a man who creates conditions that force others into the positions he wants them in, while maintaining the appearance of their having chosen those positions freely. I supported myself through teaching assistantships and part-time work, and a stubborn refusal to need anything from him, which felt at the time like strength, and which I understand now as the first of many ways the anger shaped my behavior in directions that were not entirely healthy. We resumed a version of contact after 2 years, at my mother's persistent and careful orchestration, because my mother understood that complete rupture served no one, and that partial connection was better than none, and because she was willing to do the work of maintaining it, even when neither her husband nor her son was particularly cooperative about meeting her halfway. The version of contact we resumed was cordial and careful and hollow in the way that contact between people who have not addressed the thing between them is always hollow, a performance of relationship that fools no one and that exhausts everyone involved. I finished my doctorate, became a professor of literature at a university in Ohio, and built a professional life that I found genuinely meaningful and that I was, by any reasonable external measure, good at. I published work I was proud of. I was, my students told me over many years, a good teacher, and the telling of it mattered to me in the specific way that things matter when they serve as evidence against an indictment you are carrying, evidence that the choice you made was not in fact the self-indulgent waste that someone important told you it was. I married a woman named Sylvia in 1979. Sylvia was from a family that was different from mine, in a way that I found both deeply attractive and occasionally disorienting. A family in which people said what they thought to each other with a directness and a warmth that were simultaneous rather than mutually exclusive, in which disagreement did not carry the weight of authority and submission that disagreement had carried in my father's house. She was the first person in my adult life with whom I was genuinely unguarded, which was a condition I had not previously understood myself to be capable of, and which I arrived at slowly and with more difficulty than she deserved. We have been married 45 years, and we have 2 children, a son named Marcus and a daughter named Claire, and I want to say something about how I fathered them that is relevant to everything I am going to tell you, because the anger I carried toward my father did not stay contained to my relationship with my father. It traveled, the way these things always travel, into the relationships that came after, and one of the most painful parts of the accounting I eventually had to do was understanding how and where it had traveled and what it had done when it arrived. I was not my father with my children. I want to say that clearly because it is true and because I think it matters to say, and also because the relief I felt in not being my father was something I allowed to substitute for too long for the harder question of who I actually was with them. I was not domineering. I was not contemptuous of their choices. I did not fill the house with the pressure that my father's presence had created in the house I grew up in. But I was, in ways that took me longer to see, emotionally guarded with them in a way that had its roots in the same place the anger had its roots, in the experience of being known by someone who then used the knowing against you, and in the protection that distance provides against a repetition of that experience. Marcus told me something when he was in his 30s that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Dad, I always knew you loved me, but I never felt like you let me all the way in, and I didn't know whether that was about me or about you, and not knowing made it harder than it probably needed to be." He said it without accusation, in the way of someone who has processed something enough to be able to say it clearly, and I received it the way I had learned, by then and with Sylvia's consistent help, to receive difficult things without immediate defense, with the attempt at genuine hearing. I knew, when he said it, that it was about me, specifically about the way I had managed intimacy across my entire adult life, keeping something in reserve, maintaining a portion of myself that was not fully available to anyone, as protection against the thing my father had done, which was to know me well enough to aim something precisely, and then to aim it. The protection was real in the sense that it prevented a repetition of that specific injury, and it was costly in the sense that it also prevented the kinds of connection that require the removal of exactly that kind of protection, and I had paid the cost across 40 years without fully understanding what I was paying for. My father died in 2001. He was 78 years old, and his death came after a decline of about 2 years, during which I was present in the way that a dutiful son is present when a parent is dying, visiting, handling practical matters, sitting in the hospital with a quality of attention that was genuine in some respects and managed in others. We did not have the conversation that I had been telling myself, across 30 years of anger, that I would have with him when the time was right. The time, it turned out, was never right, and then there was no more time, and he died without my having said any of the things I had accumulated to say, and I went back to Ohio and to my life, and carried the unfinished business of him, the way you carry things that have nowhere to go, internally and without resolution. For about 5 years after his death, the anger continued in its established form, which is to say, it continued as if he were still alive and still responsible for maintaining it, which is one of the stranger features of anger at the dead, the way it does not immediately recognize the death as a change in its operating conditions. I was angry at him after he died the way I had been angry at him while he was alive, with the same quality and in the same contexts, and I did not understand for some time that the anger was now in a situation it had not previously been in, which was a situation in which it had nowhere to go and nothing to act on, and no possibility of resolution through any action one could take, because the person at whom it was directed was no longer available for the confrontation that resolution, in my model of how these things worked, required. The shift began not with a single event, but with a book, which is perhaps appropriate, given what I had spent my professional life teaching. I was 63 years old, and I was teaching a course on autobiography, and one of the texts I had taught many times before produced in me that year a response I had not had in previous encounters with it, the particular response of reading something at the right moment in your own development to receive what it is actually offering, rather than what you previously understood it to be about. The text was about a man reckoning with his father, not in the self-help sense, not in the therapeutic sense, but in the literary sense, which is to say, it was about trying to understand another person's life from the inside rather than judging it from the outside, and about what changes when you attempt that understanding and what it costs and what it produces. I taught that book, and I went home, and I thought about my father in a way I had not previously allowed myself to think about him, which is to say, I thought about him as a person rather than as a force that had acted upon me. I thought about him at 22, which was the age I was when the thing at the dinner table happened, and I tried, with genuine effort and against the considerable resistance of 30 years of established narrative, to understand what he was at 22, what he had been given and what he had been denied, what he understood about himself and about what he was supposed to be. My father was born in 1923. I want you to hold that year because it is as structural to his story as the year 1966 is to mine. the year he was born, and the world he was born into, and what that world required of him before he had any say in the requirements. He grew up in the Depression, which shaped him in ways I had acknowledged abstractly for years, without ever following the acknowledgement into its implications, which is that a man shaped by the Depression understood scarcity not as a concept, but as a physical memory, as a felt and embodied knowledge of what it meant for things to run out, and that this understanding, internalized at the age of 6 or 7 or 8, does not yield easily to the evidence of later sufficiency. He was 19 years old when the United States entered the Second World War, and he served in the Pacific for 3 years, which I knew as a biographical fact about him, and which I had never, in 30 years of being angry at him, taken seriously as an experience that might have done something to the person who had it. He did not talk about the war. Soldiers of his generation and his temperament did not talk about the war, and the not talking was not concealment in the sense that implies something to conceal, but rather the absence of a framework, the literal unavailability of a vocabulary, or a context in which the experience could be processed or shared. He came home in 1945 with whatever the war had put in him, and he married my mother, and went to work and raised a family, and was, by the measures available to him, a success. And what the war had put in him stayed in him, unexpressed and unaddressed, for the rest of his life. I am not telling you this to excuse what he did. I told you at the beginning that the forgiveness I arrived at was not the erasure of accuracy, and I meant that. What he did at the dinner table when I was 22 was hurtful and unnecessary, and reflected a limitation in him that was real and that had real consequences. I am telling you this to explain what happened when I stopped looking at him as the agent of that event and started looking at him as a person who had arrived at that event through a route that I had never previously tried to understand, and what happened when I tried to understand it. What happened was complicated and took years and did not produce a clean resolution. But what it began to produce incrementally and without announcement was something I can only describe as dimensional. He became, in my understanding, a person with dimensions I had not previously given him, a person who was not simply the source of the anger, but a human being who had been given a specific set of conditions and tools and limitations, and who had done with them what he could, which was sometimes not enough and sometimes harmful. And also, I began to allow myself to see, sometimes more than I had credited. He came to every school event I had from the time I was 6 until I graduated from high school. I had filed this under the category of obligatory parental presence, under the heading of things he did because they were expected rather than because he chose them. And when I examined that filing, I found it was not accurate. He came because he wanted to come. I have a memory, retrieved from somewhere I had not gone in 30 years, of my father watching me receive an award at a school assembly when I was 14, and of the expression on his face in the moment before he knew I was looking at him. It was an expression I can only describe as pride in its uncomplicated form, the pure and unmanaged version of the feeling before it was converted into whatever he thought was the appropriate expression of it, which was a restrained nod and a brief handshake on the way home. He was proud of me. He had always been proud of me. The contempt at the dinner table when I was 22 was not the absence of pride, but its distortion through the filter of his fear, the fear of a man who had lived through the Depression and who understood, in his bones, that impractical choices led to the kind of vulnerability that he had organized his entire life around preventing, and whose love expressed itself, in that moment, as the attempt to protect me from a risk he genuinely believed I was taking, in the only language he had available, which was the language of control and authority rather than the language of concern, because the language of concern was not one he had been given access to. I understood this, sitting with it at 63 and 64 and 65, not all at once, but in accumulation, and the understanding changed something that the anger had not changed, which was the story I told about who my father was, and therefore about who I was in relation to him. The story the anger told was a story in which I was the person who had been wronged, and he was the person who had wronged me. And while that story was accurate as far as it went, it did not go far enough to account for the full truth of him, which included the pride and the fear and the war and the depression and the particular constraints of a man who had been formed by forces he had not chosen and who had given me, along with the damage, things I had not been counting. He gave me my stubbornness, my refusal to accept other people's assessments of what was possible for me, which had felt like a reaction against him, but which was also, I understand now, the same quality in him that had gotten him through the Depression and the Pacific and 30 years in a factory, applied to my own circumstances by a son who had absorbed more of his father than he had acknowledged. He gave me the capacity for sustained effort, the willingness to do the difficult thing consistently and without complaint, which are not glamorous virtues, but which are the virtues that actually sustain a professional life across decades. He gave me, by negative example, the understanding that control is not connection, which made me a better husband and a more available father than I might otherwise have been, which is a strange gift, but a real one. I began talking to him, not in any formal or ritualistic sense, not with candles or photographs, or any of the apparatus that people sometimes use to create the occasion for this kind of communication. Just talking, the way you talk to yourself when you are thinking something through, except directed, consciously and with intention, toward him, toward the person I was constructing through, the understanding I was arriving at, the full-dimensional person, rather than the flattened figure the anger had substituted for him. I told him I understood, or was trying to. I told him that what he did at the dinner table had hurt me in ways that took 30 years to fully map, and that the 30 years of anger had cost me things I was still identifying, and that I had also, in the accounting I was doing, found more on the credit side of the ledger than I had previously been willing to look at. I told him that I wished we had been able to talk, actually talk, the way I was talking to him now while he was alive, and that I understood, having thought about it carefully, why we probably couldn't have, because the talking requires a vocabulary that neither of us had been given, and that neither of us had learned to build on our own, until it was too late for the talking to happen in real time. I told him I forgave him, not in the sense of absolving him of responsibility, because I don't think forgiveness requires that, and I am not sure it should, but in the sense of releasing the claim I had been holding, the claim that said he owed me something he could now never pay, that the debt was outstanding, and that its outstandingness was a legitimate reason to continue carrying the anger that the debt had generated. I released that claim not because it was illegitimate, but because holding it was no longer serving me, and had not been serving me for some time, and because the person I was talking to when I talked to the anger was no longer my father, but a version of him that I had constructed from 30 years of a single incident and its aftermath, and that version was not accurate enough to warrant the continued investment. The release was not a single moment. I want to say that because I think the narrative of forgiveness often implies a breakthrough, a specific occasion on which the thing is achieved and the condition changes, and that was not my experience. My experience was more like a slow revision, a gradual replacement of one story with another, the flattened figure becoming more dimensional across months, and then years, the anger becoming something more like grief, and then something more like a complicated love, and then something that I do not have a precise word for, but that is quieter than any of those, and that includes all of them. My son Marcus has a difficult relationship with his own anger, which he has talked to me about with the openness that Sylvia and I tried to create the conditions for, and that he extended to us with a generosity that I do not take for granted. He carries anger at certain things that were done to him in his 20s by people who had some power over him, and the anger is accurate, and the things that generated it were real. He has asked me in several conversations how I managed to let go of what I was carrying, and I have tried to answer him honestly, which means telling him that I did not let it go so much as I replaced it with something more complete, something that included the anger, but was not limited to it. What I tell him is that the anger was telling a true story in a limited way. The way a photograph taken from one angle tells a true story about the thing it is, photographing while leaving out everything the camera cannot see from where it is standing. The photograph is not false, but it is not the whole subject. The whole subject, in my father's case, and I suspect in most cases, is considerably more complex and more human and more worthy of genuine understanding than the single angle of the anger is able to show. And the understanding that becomes available when you move the camera, when you try to see the subject from other angles, including the angle of the subject's own experience, is not a comfort exactly, but it is a completion. And the completion changes what you are carrying, even when it does not erase it. I am 75 years old, and I am still in conversation with my father. The conversations are different now than they were when I began them 12 years ago. Less concerned with accounting, and more concerned with something that is harder to name, something that functions like curiosity, a genuine interest in the person he was, that I did not have when he was alive, and that I have developed, improbably and at length, after his death. I find myself wondering about his experience of the war in a way I never asked about when I could have asked. I find myself curious about what he wanted, not what he provided or what he controlled, but what he actually wanted for his own life, whether he got any of it, whether he knew what it was. I cannot know those things. That is the loss inside the forgiveness, the irreversible limit of making peace with a dead man, which is that the peace is unilateral, and the conversation is one-sided, and the questions you finally have the courage to ask are questions that will never be answered by the person you are asking. I hold that loss alongside the peace, because they belong together, because the peace that does not include the loss of what the anger prevented is not the full truth of what I arrived at, and the full truth is the only version I am interested in at 75. I went back to Detroit 3 years ago, to the neighborhood where I grew up, which had changed considerably in the ways that all such neighborhoods change across 60 years, and I stood in front of the house my father had bought and maintained for 30 years, with the consistency and the determination of a man who understood that the house was evidence of something important. And I stood there for a long time looking at it, and I thought about the boy who had grown up inside it, which was me, and about the man who had built it into a home for that boy, which was my father. And I tried to hold both of those people in my attention simultaneously, the boy who was hurt and the man who did the hurting, and who was also the man who came to every school, assembly, and who felt pride in its uncomplicated form when he thought no one was watching. I am still trying to hold them both. That is, at 75, the ongoing work. Not the resolution of the contradiction, because I am not sure the contradiction resolves, but the willingness to hold it, to keep both people in the frame, rather than collapsing into the version that is simpler and more emotionally convenient. The anger was simpler. The peace is harder and more spacious and contains more of the truth. If you are carrying something like what I carried, a sustained anger at someone who hurt you and who is no longer available for the confrontation that justice seems to require, I am not going to tell you to let it go, because that instruction, offered without what it takes to follow it, is not useful. What I am going to tell you is that there is more to the person you are angry at than the anger can show you, and that finding the more does not require forgiving in the sense of absolution, or pretending the hurt was not real, and that the finding is worth doing not for the other person, who in my case was beyond the reach of anything I might do for them, but for yourself, for the version of yourself that exists on the other side of the story the anger is telling, which is larger and quieter and more free. My father was a limited man who loved me in the only ways he had. I am a limited man who is still learning, at 75, what the ways are. That is the whole of it. That is what 30 years of anger and 12 years of conversation with a dead man have given me, and I would not trade it, the anger included, because the anger was part of the path, and the path, however long it took, led here. Here is enough. Here, finally and at some cost, is enough.